let's begin looking over Lecture 5, The Compounding of Consciousness, in William James' A Pluralistic Universe. Compounding of consciousness, that means putting together different consciousnesses to make bigger consciousnesses. So he's introduced the idea by talking about the philosopher Gustav Fechner in the previous lecture. Now he's building on that to try to give an account of the compounding of consciousness. James says, and in this video I think I'll just briefly introduce the first 2 pages and we'll have to see what happens next. James says, I wish to discuss the assumption that states of consciousness, so-called, can separate and combine themselves freely and keep their own identity unchanged while forming parts of simultaneous fields of experience of wider scope. He wants to discuss the idea that states of consciousness can separate and combine themselves. A state of consciousness can remain what it is, while also being separated from or combined with other states of consciousness. Let me first explain just what I mean by this. While you listen to my voice, perhaps, I can say this to you, and you can hear James as he says this to his original lecture listeners. Let me first explain just what I mean by this. While you listen to my voice, for example, you are perhaps inattentive to some bodily sensation due to your clothing or your posture. Yet that sensation would seem probably to be there. You're not paying attention to it, maybe, but there's some aspect of how you feel physically. Maybe the tag on the back of your shirt, for example, or how your legs feel. If you haven't stretched your legs in a bit, I'm just paying attention to it now. A few moments ago, I wasn't paying attention to how my left leg felt, and now that I'm paying attention to it, I realize it's not comfortable, so I have to adjust my legs. That sensation was there. Yet that sensation would seem probably to be there. For in an instant, by a change of attention, you can have it in one field of consciousness with the voice. So as I'm sitting here talking to you, as you're sitting there listening to me, as James' original listeners were sitting there listening to him give this lecture, we are experiencing some sensation that we're not even paying attention to. But by a quick, simple change, that sensation joins up with our experience of listening to you to my voice, me listening to my own voice, James' listeners listening to him. I don't know if you can listen to the rain and the wind, but it's just picked up a bit in the background. It seems as if it existed first in a separate form, and then as if without itself changing, it combined with your other coexistent sensations. It is after this analogy that pantheistic idealism thinks that we exist in the absolute. And again, Fechner's account of this is better than the usual Hegelian account of this. The idea James is exploring is pantheistic idealism, or pantheism. The idea that all is divine, the idea that mind contains everything. But James is particularly interested in a pluralistic version of this, a pluralistic, pantheistic account of reality. Not all pantheism is necessarily monism. It's possible to say that all is divine, but not all is one. James is exploring that idea and contrasting it with the usual view of the Hegelian philosophers who were influential in James' day. Their view was a monistic pantheism. All is divine, all is one. So James says, this analogy from our own experience is the way pantheistic idealism thinks that we exist in the absolute mind of God. The absolute, it thinks, makes the world by knowing the whole of it at once in one undivided eternal act. To be, really to be, is to be as it knows us to be, along with everything else, namely enclosed with the fullness of our meaning. Meanwhile, we are at the same time not only really and as it knows us, but also apparently, for to our separate single selves we appear without most other things and unable to declare with any fullness what our own meaning is. So, Hegelian absolutist pantheism says all reality is ultimately the mind of God, and we, with our smaller minds, appear to exist independently, separately from God. If we really understood ourselves properly, we would understand we're actually a part of God, and there is no reality except the mind of God. And this is best understood, this theory is best understood after the analogy of our own experience, where you could pay attention to some conscious state that you are experiencing, or some conscious state that you are experiencing that is not actually merged with your present consciousness, because you are experiencing some physical sensation that you're not even paying attention to, and the moment you pay attention to it, it joins the broader whole of what you're currently paying attention to, and it exists in a sense distinct from your overall state of awareness, but it also is or becomes a part of it. This is the right analogy for thinking through our relation to the mind of God on this Hegelian view. But keep in mind, at all times James is talking about this Hegelian picture and distinguishing it from his own picture. He's going to, we'll probably see that a lot in this chapter. He'll be always talking about either the Hegelian picture on a model of the compounding of consciousness, the building up of some consciousness out of other consciousnesses. He's conscious, not conscience, not Jiminy Cricket from the Disney movie, but consciousness, i.e. state of experience, state of awareness. He's going to be using this analogy, this empirical analogy of a compounding of consciousness. He's going to use this empirical analogy of how compounding of consciousness works in our own selves as a way of understanding the notion of the compounding of consciousness. And he's going to be trying to figure out how that works in Hegelian thought, but also contrast it with how it works in his own pluralistic pantheism that he's trying to develop and distinguish from the Hegelian pantheism. Now, the classic doctrine of pantheistic idealism, from the Upanishads down to Josiah Royce, that's the Upanishads, some ancient Hindu texts, and all the way down to Josiah Royce, a recent American philosopher, is that the finite knowers, in spite of their apparent ignorance, are one with the knower of the all. The classic doctrine of pantheistic idealism is all is part of the mind of God, although we don't always realize it. In the most limited moments of our private experience, the absolute idea, as Dr. McTaggart told us, is implicitly contained. The moments, as Royce says, exist only in relation to it. They are true or erroneous only through its overshadowing presence. Of the larger self that alone eternally is, they are organic parts. They are only inasmuch as they are implicated in its being. So the Hegelian philosophers, with some connections to ancient Hinduism, say that our finite minds really are only parts of the mind of God, and sometimes we don't realize that, etc. There is thus in reality but this one self, consciously inclusive of all the lesser selves, logos. That's a Greek word, logos, for word. You could also perhaps translate it reason. I'm not going to pause and try to remember all the different ways of thinking through logos, but it's a biblical word. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was... in archaea, logos, kai, logos, and prostantheon. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's how John opens his Gospel, talking about Jesus as the divine logos. There is thus in reality but this one self, consciously inclusive of all the lesser selves, logos, problem solver, and all-knower. And Royce, Josiah Royce, ingeniously compares the ignorance that in our persons breaks out in the midst of its complete knowledge and isolates me from you and both of us from it to the attention into which our finite minds are liable to fall with respect to such implicitly present details of those corporeal sensations to which I made allusion just now. So let me pause to say something. If you really want to understand this book, we're going to have to do a lot of the backstory. Now, I'm in a position to explain some of the backstory. Like, I am in a pretty good position to recognize certain connections to some of the philosophers and to James' earlier writings. But I'm no great scholar of Hegel, nor of the Hegelian scholars James is interacting with. But let me mention three people in particular. If you really wanted to master William James' well-developed account of what he calls radical empiricism in this book, A Pluralistic Universe, three thinkers that are probably the most important are going to be Gustav Theodor Fechner, subject of Lecture 4, and Josiah Royce, American philosopher, and probably also Bergson, Henry Bergson, or Henri Bergson, French philosopher, Henri Bergson, Bergson. So later, he's going to talk a lot about Bergson. So Bergson, Royce, and Fechner are three significant influences on this book. I confess what the cupbearer says to the Pharaoh in the NIV 1984. Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. I haven't studied these guys properly either. I can only study one book at a time. I'm trying to get a better working understanding of this. God willing, inshallah, it would be great if I can go back and read all the other books. I just can't promise to prioritize Royce, Fechner, Bergson, his backstory to this book over all the books in Kant and Confucianism and all the theology books I still haven't read. Anyway, where was I? Royce, Josiah Royce now. Josiah Royce brilliantly, James explains that Josiah Royce brilliantly gives his idealistic, pantheistic, monistic account, his account of all reality being divine and all reality being one. All reality is ultimately the mind of God, although we don't always understand that. He brilliantly gives this account in much the same way Fechner gave his account in the previous lecture, Lecture 4. So here in Lecture 5, James opens up by observing Josiah Royce makes the right kind of analogy, the empirical analogy, from the way our own states of consciousness are indeed states of consciousness, distinct things that come apart and come together and are merged into a larger state, just as if you just pay attention to the toes on your left foot right now, you might realize there's some sensation you were having, but it wasn't something you were aware of at just that moment. Just pay attention to it for a moment, and it merges with your state of consciousness as you sit here listening to this philosophy nerd on YouTube or on Rumble. Those sensations stand to our total private minds in the same relation in which our private minds stand to the absolute mind. So your sensation of what's happening in, now I'm going to suggest, your left ear. What's happening over on the left side of your face that you weren't paying attention to, now you're paying attention to it. The relation of that sensation to your overall state that now includes paying attention to that sensation, that is now merged with that sensation. The relation of that sensation to your overall conscious state is the same as the relation of your mind to the mind of God. Privacy means ignorance. I still quote Royce, and ignorance means inattention. Ignorance means inattention. We are finite because our wills as such are only fragments of the absolute will, because will means interest. And an incomplete will means an incomplete interest, and because incompleteness of interest means inattention to much that a fuller interest would bring us to perceive. In this account, Royce makes by far the manliest, manly is a good quality here, Royce makes by far the manliness, Royce makes by far the manliest of the post-Hegelian attempts to read some empirically apprehensible content into the notion of our relation to the absolute mind. Royce has done a manly thing, meaning a good thing. Royce has done a good thing. He's made the best effort so far of including some empirically comprehensible content in the explanation of how our minds relate to the mind of God that we're all a part of according to the Hegelian philosophy. So Royce has brought some ideas we can understand empirically from our own experience and use them to explain how our minds relate to God. Good job, Royce. In the end, James is not going to fully agree with Royce, just like Fechner and I dare say Bergson, but he's going to say these guys are freaking geniuses and they're contributing something to a different alternative, which I say, the pluralistic, pantheistic alternative, all is divine but not all is one, that I say, says James, is first, logically permissible. It's not an unreasonable view. And second, it is a better view than the Hegelian monistic pantheism. All is divine, all is one. It's a better view for certain reasons, which James will continue to elaborate on. We've seen a few already. Now I've continued this video long enough. Let's wrap it up with the last paragraph of page 2 in this edition. I have to admit, now that I propose to you to scrutinize this assumption rather closely, that trepidation seizes me. The subject is a subtle and abstruse one, etc. Nevertheless, I must not flinch from my task here, etc. So he's going to try to consider carefully this idea of the compounding of consciousness, of how different consciousnesses are separate from each other, come apart from each other, and come together to form larger states of consciousness. He's going to consider that idea in this lecture, and he's a little nervous because it's a really subtle idea to try to explain, the idea of the compounding of consciousness. So I'll do what I can to explain, James doing what he can to explain the idea of the compounding of consciousness in one or more subsequent video or videos on Lecture 5.